Welcome back to the channel folks, and to another painting tutorial. This time it's perhaps one of the coolest looking tanks of the war, though maybe one of the trickiest formations to use in the game. That's the Jagdpanther, the heavy tank destroyer. Now with the release of Bulge German, we can start using these in the game again. I had a box of 5 kicking about, so I thought I'm going to paint these up, but I'm going to do a very distinctive and very different kind of camo. Very much a late war kind of camo. And you can see here I have a camo which is based on Jagdpanther 823, which is an historical reference used by lots of modelers because it's quite an attractive and distinctive pattern. It's a Panzer Lehr Jagdpanther. I'm going to be concentrating in this video on painting the camo and applying the weathering. Now the camo has been painted using airbrush and masks. Because you're going to be, with a mask, you're going to be attaching the mask and then stripping it off. I find it's best to have a good solid undercoat, and then your initial coat, in this case saddle brown, applied a good day before you start working it. There's a risk of paint peeling off when you are peeling off the mask. I use Tamiya as an undercoat because it doesn't peel. You can scratch it by all means, but it won't peel off in a way that paint or other kind of polyurethane undercoats can do. But let's get started folks. We're going to start you from the point where all you've got is an undercoat of saddle brown, and we'll take you through the steps. So here is the platoon undercoated and rested. I've actually left it for a few days because I went on to some other projects that I wanted to work on at the same time. Now you can see a bit of the red-brown, the Tamiya red-brown showing on the tracks. I've applied the saddle brown all over, but not on the wheels, not the tracks, because they're going to be green at the end of the day. They're not going to be getting masked, just going to be one colour right the way across. So that's the saddle brown on and dried, ready. So I'm using my trusty blob of blue tack. I've been using this for over 10 years folks. If ever there was an example of, to prove the tight Scotsman myth, this must be it. But I find it very effective, and it just eats up the paint, so you're not going to be worried about it becoming discoloured or not sticking. It works a treat. Now a quick word on order of spray, so to speak. I've got 3 colours I'm going to be using here. What you can see is the saddle brown that I've applied already. Then we've got dark sand. And then we've got Italian tank crew, and that's my sort of late war hard edge camo palette for the Germans. So when I'm applying any kind of hard edge camo, I first of all apply the colour that I want the most control over. For instance, many late war camos have got just a little bit of yellow in it, the dark sand in this case. So I would apply that first. In this case, it's the saddle brown because this is a stripy camo and we need to create those stripes. The final colour should always be the colour that's going to dominate. And this, in most cases, typically the colour that's going to be on the wheels, but the colour that's going to dominate, in this case it's going to be the Italian tank crew. Most of this tank is going to be green, so that's going to be the last colour that I apply. So this, as you see it, is going to be the order of spray with this colour already in place. So let's get started with the all-important masking here. This is key to us getting the look that we're after. So I've made very thin strips of mask. Now whenever you're applying masks folks, it's very important to understand that what you put on when you initially make contact with the miniature is not necessarily going to represent the final size of the mask, because you're going to push it down to make it sit firmly in place, and that can widen the size, in this case the strips, widen the strips, or increase the footprint of any sort of camo blotches that you're putting on. So always start with something which is actually a bit smaller than your final requirements will be, so when you're putting it down and spreading it out into place, there's not too much masking material on there that then sort of tempts you into just keep spreading it out and ending up with too big a camo blotch or a strip in this case. So here I'm looking to create the right kind of shapes. We don't just want very straight masks here. If we look at the pictures of the 823 and other examples of completed models, we want something a little bit wiggly and certainly with rough edges, and we want to keep a fairly even kind of distance between them, but not an exact distance. We don't want it looking too precise and symmetrical. And then consider how many stripes you want, because we need the green to be the most dominating colour, and we need the stripes to be big enough for us to practically work with. Once the strips are in place, I have to fine tune them, get any little squiggles, little turns, little kinks into the lines, but also keep the edges down tight. That's something that's important when you're masking, to prevent paint drifting in underneath the edge of the mask and perhaps softening the edge. You want a nice sharp edge. Here it's very tricky for me because I want thin lines, but at the same time I want to have sufficient material in the masking line so that I can, after I have sprayed a coat of dark sand on, so I can ease out the edges all the way along each side of the mask, so that I'm going to mask a very thin line of yellow right along the edge, as you will see. The camo on the barrel here is quite simple. It's just stripes once again, nothing going along the length of the barrel, just around the circumference. So this really just needs little blobs put on. On the barrel, folks, make sure you're putting on really quite small amounts of blue tack. You'd be surprised how far a little bit of masking goes on such a small area. On this one I've not continued the brown stripe all the way down the side, because in the examples I've seen there are some that have a brown stripe just changing into a purely yellow stripe, so we'll mask that later. So now we're ready for our next camo colour, the dark sand. So just spray it on, nothing too strenuous here folks, just make sure you're applying it in nice thin coats. When airbrushing, make sure you're moving the kit around in your hand so that the paint is striking it from all angles. That prevents little shadows behind, like little features like periscopes, machine guns, areas of the engine deck, and make sure that when you're working these small areas that you are just applying little amounts of paint. Don't blast these small areas, otherwise you'll drown it very quickly. And then make sure you're getting in nice and tight around the masking to get as solid an edge as possible. Okay, so that is the dark sand applied. We've given it, just normal sort of drying time to make sure that it's, touch dry, and we're ready to do some more masking. I'm starting with the blank areas that I left, so there's not going to be any dark brown showing. We're going to create a line of dark sand here, and I just apply this in the same way as I did the other mask. Now, to create the thin yellow line that we're after, this is going to take a bit of concentration folks. You don't want to overwork an area of mask or forget to work it, though it is okay to have a brown and yellow stripe, but you don't want any stripes that are just purely brown when you are peeling off the mask here. So we're going to work along the edges of the blue tack, of the masking material, and we're just going to push out just a tiny amount. I mean, it amounts to just millimetres, just pushing it out. You don't have to worry too much about the shape, just don't try to make it look very toothy when you're pushing it out. Don't do a little push and then a little push and a little push, so it's like hundreds of little lumps all along the side. Where you can, use the flat part of the cocktail stick as well as the point of the cocktail stick just to work the edges out. I recommend doing all along one side of a strip and then all along the other side of a strip, and systematically work through it so that you're not missing anything, and keep the pushing motions that you're doing, keep them small, folks. We want a really small line either side of the brown line, otherwise the proportions are going to look completely wrong. Patience is key to this, folks, so if you feel that it's maybe beginning to wear on you and you just want to get the job done, take a break, walk away from it for a bit, and then come back to it and make sure that you're taking a nice steady approach and not rushing it. It probably doesn't look as though we're actually doing much here, or masking very much here when you're looking at it, but that's a sign that we're doing it right if the masking isn't getting substantially bigger or wider. And now we're ready for the final coat of paint. Just a wee word here, folks, be careful when you're handling the masked vehicles that you're not changing the shape of the mask, you're not pushing too hard. I don't use any kind of attachment or handle for my kits. I just crack on, because I just want to get it done. You might use something like that, but in any case, make sure you don't pick it up in a way that's going to change the shape of a mask, and that you don't put the two tanks together so that the blue tack sticks to each other. That can also be a problem. So, just as before, we're going to apply the green in nice even coats, watching out for shadows, watching out with the edges of the mask, and remembering that we need to get the wheels now, because this is the final coat and the wheels are going to be green. And now for the scary bit, folks, we're going to remove the mask and see if we've actually created what we intended. So we need to be careful at this point, folks, that we are not scraping the paint. It's not been varnished yet, so it is vulnerable to fingernails or to the cocktail stick if you're having to use a cocktail stick. I like to kind of grab a little lump on the back of the mask that I'm using and then just try and pull it off, and in most cases it will strip away. Other times I might need to use a cocktail stick. That's usually on pieces that are hard to get the fingers into, and then there's other times where you just need to take a lump off your blue tack and then dab it onto the area that you need to pull off, and it will catch it and pull it away. There may be little bits, tiny little bits of blue tack left on the surface. You might see them as you're working it, or you might come across them as you are continuing to paint the kit. So if you do see them, once again, you can just take a larger bit of blue tack, dab it on top, and it will lift off nice and easy. Right, folks, that's them all stripped down. Generally speaking, I'm quite happy. There's a couple of bits that are going to need touched up. It's inevitable that some paint gets scraped, and also that there are some issues with the masking. The main areas of concern I have is where the yellow has bled into the brown because I didn't push the first strip down hard enough. I was trying to control the size. When you're controlling the shapes that you're trying to make, just make sure you get your edges down. There's just a couple of bits, there's a bit there for instance, where I would just very carefully with some thin paint just get rid of that soft edge between the brown and the yellow. Otherwise it's fine. Normally you get lots of little bits getting stripped off by the blue tack. In this case, where does it go? Let's see. I only lost one side skirt, so I just have to glue that back on. Very carefully, folks. Don't use very runny glue if you are reattaching a piece of painted plastic that has come off, because the capillary action will just make it run everywhere and ruin the paint. So just put a few dots of nice thick glue, let me see, of that type, not of that type, extra thin. So I'm now ready to move on to, as I said, a few touch-ups, and then tracks, wheels, varnish, wash, and so on and so on. So I'm touching up the saddle brown here, folks. Make sure the paint's gone on nice and thin. Once again, if you need to take more than one coat, then do that. Don't try and do it all in a oneer, otherwise you're going to start to lose that flat finish that you're after, and only fix the areas you absolutely need to fix. If there's some smaller areas that you think might need attention, all the other processes we're going to apply will deal with that. I'm not going to take a lot of time to show you how I paint everything else in the way of the details, like the tracks, the tyres, tools and all those kind of things. This is more about the camouflage and the weathering. But you can check out the playlists that I've got for my Flames of War painting, and there'll be a link at the end of the video, folks, and you'll see other videos where I go into that in great detail. For the wash, I'm going to use this acrylic pin wash, which I recommend very much so. It's a MIG Ammo dark wash. In this case, there's lots and lots of paints in that range. I'm going to use a really thin brush, really long narrow brush, and you can see here on the left is the paint or the wash as it comes out the bottle, but I'm thinning it down with a bit of water just to get a bit more of capillary action. And hopefully this is coming across, folks, how easily it is to apply this, especially with a thin brush, the thin long brush that can hold a sufficient amount of the wash. You just touch it to the features and it will go around. You can apply it in such small tiny little amounts for those smaller areas, or you can fill in the long deeper panel lines. Very, very easy, folks. Pin washing is another one of those processes that takes a great deal of patience. It's not like just firing a wash all over the surface and then tidying it up. Here we're going to apply small amounts of wash in very small areas and then tidy it up very carefully, drawing excess wash off, cleaning the brush, working the paint again back into the recesses. So we're not darkening the surface too much as we go. We're applying the wash just where we want it to go, tidying up the excess, and then we're going to be confident about the tone and colour of the final look. As I mentioned before, this is an acrylic pin wash, which means you don't need thinners to work it as you would with enamels. I find that in the deeper areas it remains workable for longer, in the flatter areas it dries quicker. So you need to clean the flat areas pretty much straight away. That's my experience. As soon as you get it on, maybe work an area such as the engine deck, and then clean it all. And you just have to use water to do it, folks. Just clean your brush, refresh it. Don't drown the surface with water. Make sure the brush is just moist. Draw off the excess, work what's left on the tank to your satisfaction, and then clean your brush again and repeat. So once again, folks, if you feel as though it's getting wearisome and you're getting tired, leave it, come back to it and start it afresh so that you can have the right mental approach and get the right result. Now the wash will dry depending on how much you've applied, By that I mean the deeper areas with more wash will take longer to dry than the smaller areas with less wash, like the smaller features, the gaps in the side skirts here. So I tend to move on to other tasks and let the wash become touch dry before I would consider applying any further washes, or, as you'll see, any water-based weathering. Next up is highlighting and chipping. I'm covering both of them in the same section because I tend to combine the both, in as much as the highlighting, which is lightening of the edges and around panels and such likes, is inevitably going to impact on the final chipping that you're going to be adding, because the edges of panels and hatches and such likes are the areas that are likely to have the chipping applied. So we are effectively starting by edge highlighting, but it's a broken edge highlight that we're after here. We don't want to put the highlight all the way along the edge, because that's very bold, very bright, and kind of stands out as edge highlighting. We just want the edges to catch the eye and the highlights to be broken, so that it will start the process of the sort of broken and irregular chipping that we're going to apply. The colour I'm using for this is green grey. It's a good universal highlighter for any tank that's green. It is light but not bright, which means you're not creating a bright edge, you're creating just a lighter edge that suggests, in the first instance, a soft highlight, or the upper layer of the paint having been removed and a lighter layer exposed for those less deep chips, and the chips and scratches that you're creating are the starting point for the deep scratches that we'll apply next. After applying the edge highlights to periscopes, panels, hatches and so on, we're now going to work on the flat featureless areas, you know, the side panels, the big slab sided sides of the Jagdpanther, the side skirts, and we're going to start applying scratches and chips across them, and that helps break them up, make them more interesting and add a bit more depth. And we're going to finish the chipping process with some German Camo black brown and a very, very fine brush. What we want to do here is place a very thin line of German Camo black brown within the larger scratches that we've created with the green grey. That includes the edges as well as the flat areas. Don't overdo the chipping process, guys. Keep it in balance. It's very easy to go crazy and have the thing looking like it's been lying in a scrapyard for 10 years. If that's your intention, crack on, but if you're making an active in-service tank, keep it balanced. I'm starting the weathering process with a little bit of airbrushing. That's why I've got the blue tack mask in place there. I'm using Panzer Ace's Light Mud to spray a very, very thin and subtle layer of dust across the bottom of the panels. It's a nice starting point for what will be one of the most weathered areas of the vehicle, and it helps give a nice definition between the upper areas of the tank and the wheels, which are otherwise the same colour. And I do this on the storage bins in the rear too, because they are directly above the tracks. The next stage of weathering here it's good for a vehicle like this, you know, which is pretty much one main colour, and it's got big slab-sided smooth surfaces. Now I'm going to be creating streaks across that surface to help soften the panels and get something more visual going on, and I'm using the dust wash from the acrylic MIG wash range that I've used already for the pin wash. We need to be applying this in very small amounts, because once you start dragging it over the surface with a damp brush, just damp brush folks, it will start to cover a lot of area, and you don't want it to become semi-opaque. You just want streaks as accents on the vehicle rather than it becoming the dominant feature on the vehicle. Now you can keep working this to a degree. You can easily add more. You can take the paint off, but one important point is the drier you apply it, the harder it will be to remove it. So you're going to have to practice a bit to get the hang of it, so you're not putting it on too wet so that it just disappears, you know, just flows away across the surface, and you're not putting it on too dry so that you end up not being able to work it. But remember folks, if you do have a few issues, it's not a problem, because you know, like, streaking and weathering isn't a regular thing that will always happen in a certain way, you know, so you can just call it nature, call it what you want. It's just the way your tank is. You can see here applying some dots, and then I'm preparing my brush. I'm using a white brush there, making sure that it's not too wet, and then drawing down those lines. That's a good way of approaching these larger surfaces on the side and the side panel, and I'm controlling the dampness of the brush on my finger and using it when it looks right. For the wheels, tracks and other running gear, I want to use a light wash, but I don't want to use the dust wash because it's too similar to the upper hull, and I want this to look different, you know, weathered in a different way. So I'm going to use pigment powder, which is a very good way of creating the appearance of dirt. I am applying it in very, very small, thin amounts. You can see from how I prepared it on the palette there, there is not a lot of pigment there at all. When you're working with pigments, you want to add some, let it dry, see how it looks, then either add a bit more or take away the excess. And that's what I did with this, folks, over a couple of passes. You know, I applied it, let it dry, went back to it, removed some, added a little bit where the wash perhaps had pulled in the wrong places, and then let it dry, and then had another look. And I'm using a light coloured pigment here because the wheels are green. If you use a dark colour, it kind of loses definition, whereas the light pigment will actually help define the shapes of the wheels and tracks in a way that a dark pigment wouldn't. Having left the dust wash the light streaks for a day so that they're touch dry, I'm now going to add some dark streaks using the dark brown wash, and I'm going to apply it in the same way, except I'm going to be very careful. I'm only going to put little spots on very specific points, because I want this to be an accent to the lighter streaks to help break them up, not to re-streak the whole thing, because then it will start to get a bit out of control and start to look like some kind of freaky zebra, and we don't want that. We just want some nice accents on certain points to help break up the panels and catch the eye. And once that dark streaking has dried, we're ready to give it a coat of matte varnish, folks. You may find some of the streaks disappear a little bit underneath the matte varnish, but if you're careful and don't apply too much, then you'll be fine. So there you go, folks. Hopefully you found that to be interesting, both in terms of techniques, paints that are available, and the actual colour scheme itself. Thanks for watching. Thanks to all the subscribers out there. If you would like to subscribe, please do so, because it will help us build the channel and bring more of these kind of videos to the people who enjoy the modelling and the gaming aspects of Flames of War. And if you hit the bell button, guys, we'll definitely see you on the next one.